All right, so last week we started this 2-week series, and we were looking at things that Jesus never said. And if that seems weird to you, many of us have been in the church for a little while, been around Christians for a little while, and even if you're not a Christian, if you've been around them, you've probably heard some of these things that are said. And sometimes in the right context, said by the right person and in the right way at the right time, they just seem like they're from Scripture, or sometimes they seem like they're from Jesus himself, and often they're portrayed as if this is something Jesus said. And we kind of had a little bit of fun with this last week, and we said, you know what? Jesus never said some of the things that he's often quoted as saying. You know, some of you have seen that thing going around the internet about how you have to be careful, you know, what things you listen to on the internet, and it was from Abraham Lincoln. You know, sometimes people... It was a little bit before, you know, the internet. Okay, just making sure you're all there. Then I have to explain that one. But sometimes, you know, things are said in a certain context, and you're like, oh yeah, that sounds good. That sounds right. And often it was misquoted or taken out of context. And last week we looked at a few, but the one we kind of focused on was this one: God or Jesus just wants you to be happy. God just wants you to be happy, and that sounds great. That sounds wonderful, and if it's often said in the Christian circles, in the Christian world, it says God just wants you to be happy, and that makes us feel wonderful, but unfortunately, Jesus never said that. You can look throughout Scripture, and it's just not there. In fact, we said last week that while God wants you to be happy, I mean, as long as it's not something sinful you're participating in, I mean, Jesus delights in your happiness, God delights in your happiness, but he is much more concerned about who you are and who you are becoming. We said, like any good parent, you know, you want your children to be happy, but at the same time, who they are becoming is much more important to you than how happy they are in a moment. We said God often functions like that he is much more concerned about who you are becoming. So I don't know who said it, but it was not Jesus. It was not Jesus. So we're going to look at another one this week, and it actually is in many ways kind of a continuation on from last week's topic. But before we get there, can I just ask a question? Show of hands. Anybody feel stressed? Anybody? Yeah, there's a few. Yeah, there's you go. If you're like, no, I'm not going to say. I saw a couple of 2 hands up. Yeah, we feel stressed. Some people are not even listening to me because they're stressed out with some things going on. They're wondering why people have their hands up. They're not sure what's happening right now, but maybe they shot their hands up afterwards. They're thinking, you know, we're handing things out or something. But we're stressed. We're stressed. There's lots of things that go on in our life, and we're stressed. And as I did some research on this topic of stress, I found some very interesting things. It says 1 in 4 Canadians cite stress as a reason for leaving their jobs. 1 in 4, 25%, have left their jobs because of stress. That might be you here today. If you look down the rows, depending on how many you've got in a row, but probably if there's 8 in the row, 2 of you have left your job because it is just too much. It is too stressful, and you said, I am not going to do this anymore, and you've left because it's just too stressful. Oh, this one was interesting. 73% of all working adults aged 20 to 64 report at least some level of stress. You might be like me, and you're wondering about the 27% that just doesn't have any stress. But most of us have stress. Most of us, the vast majority of us, have stress in our lives. Here's one from Stats Canada I thought was fascinating. 23% of people over the age of 15 report most days are quite a bit or extremely stressful. And that number rises to 30% among the 35 to 54 age group. So when you look at the demographics of this room, almost 30% of people are stressed to the max. Very stressful or extremely stressful. So we kind of look around here, and I'm not pointing any fingers, but that's kind of this section, this whole section, a little bit of this section, is just maxed out. Not occasionally, not, from time to time, but we are just living in a state of constant stress. This one just floored me, and this is one I heard on the radio that I had to actually check to see if it was accurate because I just couldn't believe it. Studies show that normal children today report more anxiety than child psychiatric patients in the 1950s. Let that one sink in for a second. Are you kidding me? Not like they're getting close, not the same amount, but children today are reporting more anxiety than child psychiatric patients in the 50s. I mean, that just blows my mind. Some of you are on your phones checking it out right now. I promise I looked it up. It just blows my mind. I mean, the fact is, we are stressed. We're stressed. And that's not all bad things, but it's one thing after another adds up, right? You've got stuff at home. You've got kids and all their activities you're taking them to, and you've got helping them with the kids' homework, and you've got work stresses, and then you've got, maybe there's some marital problems or financial problems or the loss of a loved one or failing health, aging parents. You've got all sorts of stresses that just keep on piling up. You're volunteering. You try to have a social life and get together with friends, but it just seems like that's just another thing on the list. And before you know it, it just seems like you're up to here with stress. It seems like you're just kind of keeping your head above water. And ultimately, life is stressful. Life is stressful. Not all bad things, but just a number of things in your life. And you go, I just don't know what I can do. I am maxed out, and I feel so incredibly stressed. And if you've been around the church very long, if you've been a Christian very long, you have undoubtedly heard what we're going to talk about today. If you have felt like this, that life is just kind of up to my max, and you've shared, and some of you, have this feeling and just haven't shared it with some people, but if you ever shared it with people, you have undoubtedly heard what we are going to talk about today. You may have said it to someone. I have definitely said it to multiple people. I've said it to myself many times, and you might be in a similar situation, but you have heard it if you've been around the church and have anything like this situation in your life. You have heard people say, God will not give you more than you can handle. I see a few nods. God will not give you more than you can handle. And again, that sounds great, and it's meant in the best context, and again, I've said it. And you mean well when you're saying it, but Jesus never said that. We were never told you'll never given more than you can handle. I kind of wish Jesus said that, but he didn't. He didn't. In fact, this is a little bit of a misquote and actually something that's taken out of context. Those of you who kind of maybe know the Bible a little bit, you're like, okay, Jesus didn't say it, but someone did. It's in there somewhere, I'm pretty sure. Well, kind of. It's actually from a letter that Paul wrote to the Corinthian church, and he says, God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear, but when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out. He's talking about temptation. In fact, he's actually giving a history of the Israel's history to the group, and he's saying to the church, and he's saying, listen. You've seen this in your past. You've seen when people have been tempted. See, God has a plan for this group. He wants you to be separate, and he wants you to be segregated. He wants to use you guys as an example of the one true God, and you need to be different than anybody else. And he says, but time after time after time, even though that's what I've called you to, you've given in. And you've given in to temptations, and you've started doing things like everyone around you, and that has led to bad places. And it's just wrecked the plan I had for you of being separate and being the example. And so he gives a few examples, but one of them is the dietary restrictions. The Jews had a specific dietary restriction, and over time, very often, the Jewish people said, well, listen, that food looks pretty good. I mean, bacon looks awesome. I mean, how bad can it be for you? I mean, it's probably pretty good, so I'm going to eat it. And they have these different dietary restrictions that they have just kind of given in to eating what everybody else around them had. Again, that doesn't seem like a big deal, and Paul isn't necessarily focusing on that, but he's saying, but that led to another thing and another thing, and before long, you were worshiping gods that weren't me. You were worshiping gods that weren't the one true God. You were worshiping these things that you've made rather than the God in heaven who created you and sustains you. It says this is the road that it has led down. He's talking about temptation rather than anything else. He's not talking about the burdens in your life. He's not talking about the anxiety in your life. He's not talking about all the things that just stress you out. He's talking about temptation. So you can resist that cake that's sitting on your cupboard and on your counter. But that's what he's talking about. It's temptation. When it comes to temptation, you can resist. He's not talking about everything else in your life that just seems like it's too incredibly stressful. In fact, I think there's all sorts of examples. We could go around with a mic today and just have all sorts of stories after stories after stories of people who just feel that they are maxed out and God has given them more than they can handle. But there's all sorts of stories throughout Scripture as well. I want to look at a couple. One's from David, who writes this: "My guilt has overwhelmed me like a burden too heavy to bear." Too heavy to bear. "I am exhausted and completely crushed. My groans come from an anguished heart." Does that maybe describe you at all today? Where it's like, I am exhausted. I just feel like it's too much to bear. Or let's look at a quote from Jesus himself, a real quote. You can look it up. They went to a place called Gethsemane, and Jesus said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." He knows he's about to be crucified. It's only a matter of time. And he is in distress. He gathers his people around, and they're going to pray. He took Peter, James, and John along with him, and he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." That sounds like a little too much. I don't know why sometimes we think, well, Jesus had a horrible life at times, and he was killed, but God's just going to make it all nice and easy for me. He is completely overwhelmed as he looks towards what's ahead. It is just so incredibly stressful, even as God himself is going, this is a lot on me. So God may give you more than you can handle. Again, like last week, I need to work on being more uplifting sermons, but like last week, it might feel like this isn't very exciting. That God's given you, maybe allow you to have more than you can handle. And before we run out of here, I think there's a couple reasons, because we have to ask why. Why in the world would God allow you to have more than you can handle? I mean, that's a pretty obvious question. Why a God who loves you and cares about you and wants great things for you, why would he care to allow you to have more than you can handle? Well, I think there's two reasons, and there's two reasons I want to talk about this morning. First is that we rely on him, right? When things are going difficult, we rely on him. When times are going well, we don't think too much about him. It's when things are difficult that we tend to cling to him. I don't know if that's true in your life, but I think it's true in most of our lives. When things are going difficult, we tend to cling to God. And again, we look at the Israelite history, and when things are going well, they're like, oh, God who? God who? Yeah, there's somebody out there. And then when things are going bad, they're crying out to God and going, God help, God help, God help. And things are going well, and they're going, oh yeah, that God guy, I forgot about him. And then things are going badly, and they're calling out to God. And I think a lot of our lives are like that sometimes, aren't they? When things are going well, we not that we don't care about God, not that we don't believe in God, but sometimes we just don't think a whole lot about him. As we talked about this at the beginning, there's a lot of stuff going on in our lives, and it just doesn't seem like a priority at times. But when things are going difficult, when things are hard, when we just feel like we're about to drown, we often cling to him. We often go, God, I need you in this time. There's something I never shared publicly before, and I mentioned last week that I've got two little girls, and amazing little girls. One's 4.5, and one is almost 3 months old. And when my wife was pregnant with our 3-month-old daughter, we had a bit of a scare. Well, it was kind of a strange event, and didn't really, there's no real reason it happened, but kind of a fluke thing. My wife got bitten by our dog, and again, I didn't think too much of it. I grew up around dogs, so I didn't think too much of it. I fought with dogs all the time, and I came away with my hand looking like a chew toy, and had some blood and some scars and stuff like that. And to me, that was just a good playtime with the pup, and I didn't think too much about it. I mean, it wasn't like a stray dog, or the dog's basically in our backyard or on a leash or out with us, and I didn't think too much about it. And since she was pregnant, she's like, well, maybe I should go get it checked out. Maybe I should just kind of look into this a little bit. So it was late at night, and I don't know about your situation, but I tend to be the less of the worrier in the family, and she tends to worry a little bit more. And I thought she was just kind of over-exaggerating. And I thought, it's the dog, it's our dog, don't worry about it. You're going to have to go to the emergency, sit there for hours, and they're just going to go, don't worry about it, go home. Well, she goes to the doctor, and the doctor kind of gives her some pills and says, we'll keep an eye on it, and hopefully it'll get better, and we'll come back if it doesn't, and we'll look into it a little more. Well, the next day, it's a little bit more red, but again, nothing I was worried about, and I thought she was just exaggerating, and so she says, you know what, well, because of the baby, I want to just make sure everything's okay, and she goes to the doctor again. And of course, it's the emergency room, so it's a different doctor this time. And she goes and talks to the doctor, and they're kind of chatting it out a little bit. And the doctor's probably a wonderful doctor and is great at what they do, but I question their bedside manner a little bit. And anyway, at one point, the doctor looks at her and says, well, the drugs we usually give for this are pretty strong and could harm the baby. So it says, you may have to choose between the baby or your arm. Someone asked me after the first service, that is a true story. And telling my wife, this pregnant wife, you may have to choose between the baby or your arm. Now, both of them are great. My wife has an arm, and we have our beautiful little girl. But I'll tell you, we were stressed at that time. We were stressed. And to make matters worse, I was at home because we had an older daughter who's in bed, and she's there at the hospital. And after a few hours, I kind of text her, and how are things going? And she literally told me over text, and I'm going, what? Are you joking? Is this some weird, bad joke? Are you kidding me? And I quickly call her, and what's going on? And she's tears on the phone, going, this is what the doctor said. And I'm talking to her. And that was a stressful time. And I'll tell you, we were praying in that time. We were praying hard in that time. We were praying that God would step in, because like you, things get busy, and sometimes the prayer life is secondary, or it can feel like that sometimes. But it was in that time we clung to God. And I think sometimes God allows us to have more than we can handle, so we can cling to Him. Here's something that Paul wrote. He's writing to the same church in another letter he writes. He says, we don't want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about the troubles we experienced in the province of Asia. Kind of like we're talking about today. I want you to be uninformed. He's saying things are difficult. I don't want you to think that just things are absolutely rosy. Things are difficult. He says, we were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired of life itself. That's extreme. Indeed, we feel we had received the sentence of death. I don't know if you'd describe your life that way, but sometimes we just feel it is just too incredibly much. I just can't handle it. He goes on, he finishes and says, on Him we have set our hopes that He will continue to deliver us. Even in the midst of the most difficult time, He's saying, it is so incredibly hard. I am so incredibly stressed. I've got way too much going on. I just feel like I'm up here and I'm barely keeping my head above water. He says, in that time, I'm clinging to God. I'm clinging to God. I'm looking at God and going, God, help me through this. I'm clinging to God. So one of the reasons I think that God might allow you to have more than you can bear, more than you can handle, is that we will cling to Him. Reason number 2, I think, is that we can see His power. We can see His power. As I mentioned, I got 2 daughters. We've got the oldest one who's 4.5, and I mentioned last week we've been teaching her how to ride a bike. Well, the other thing we've been doing is teaching her how to swim, and that hasn't picked up quite as quickly. And she's been having a lot of fun with it. And there's a few times I've been able to be in the pool with her and swim with her. And it's kind of funny to watch her sometimes because, there's times where she's definitely needing me, and I'll have my hands on her and holding her. And, you kind of look at her and she feels like she's doing it on her own. She feels like she's just kind of, I've got this. I know Dad's still holding me, but I've kind of got this down. And then you kind of take your hands away a little bit, and she goes down a little bit, and all of a sudden she remembers who's holding her. All of a sudden she remembers that I'm there. Well, I think God's like that sometimes. When we get a little bit too close to the water, we feel like we're almost at what we can take. We remember that it's God holding us. It's God's strength and God's power that's getting us through. Paul writes later in that same letter to the Corinthian church, he says, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. It's not when I'm strong that you see God's power. When I am weak, you know it is God working in me. It's amazing, as a pastor, you hear all sorts of stories, and I've heard story after story after story of people go, I don't know what is going on right now. It has nothing to do with me. The only thing that's keeping me going is God. That's the only way I can describe it. Even people who are not even so sure about the whole God thing go, I think there's something bigger happening here, because it is definitely not my power working right now. He goes on, says, therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weakness, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weakness, in insults, in hardships, in persecution, in difficulties. Whoa! For when I am weak, then I am strong. He's saying, I am okay with all the difficulties in life, because I know in those difficulties, God is at work. I know that when my life is not going so well, God can shine all the brighter. The same guy who said things like great pressures, beyond our ability to endure, despaired of life itself, sentenced to death. He said all those things, later says, I delight in my weakness. I delight in my weakness. That's a hard thing to get to. But he's saying, when things are difficult, I know that God is at work. I know that God is holding me there. When you give God control, you no longer rely on your strength to get through difficult times. I think so often we sit there and we go, I've got this, God. You've been told that God will not give you more than you can handle, and you just feel the weight of more and more things that you've been given, and you feel God must be okay with this because he will not give you more than I can handle, so I must be able to handle it. And you are basically shaking because you just feel like it is just too much, but God must not have given me more than I can handle. But the fact is, we're not supposed to rely on our own strength. We're there holding on to it, and somehow we think we are honoring God because he has given us this, so this must be our cross to bear, and we're going to hang on to it. And we say things like, I'm handling it, God. I feel like I'm going to die, but I'm handling it. And we think somehow we're honoring God through it. But again, we look at the reasons that God may allow you to have more than you can bear. You rely more on him. You can see his power. Neither of those mean you handle it yourself. Neither of them. So often we just feel, well, God, I must be able to handle this. And you're maybe even stressing out whether God's even there, if God's even listening. And God's going, what are you doing? And we think we're proving ourselves to God. We're being a strong Christian. And God's going, what on earth are you doing? The fact is, he doesn't expect you to handle it. He doesn't expect you to handle it. Some of you here today, white-knuckling it. You feel like you're just about to go underwater. And he's not expecting you to handle it at all. At all. The fact is, we need God to get us through trials. We are not meant to do it on our own. We're not. We're not meant to do it on our own. When we go through trials, there is a God who loves us and cares about us, and a God who wants to go through it with us. He's given us people and resources around us, but we are not meant to do it on our own. We've talked a lot this morning about the isolation of life and how life is better together. Fact is, you are not meant to do life on your own. You are not meant to bear the weight of life's difficulties on your own. Just never meant to be that way. So the fact is, God may give you, there we go. God may give you more than you can handle, but he will never give you more than he can handle. We feel like, I just got to handle it. I just got to handle it. I'm hanging on. And he's going, give it to me. Give it to me. Invite me into that situation. I don't know what your situation is here today, but I know there's a lot of people who just feel like they're about to go under. Like it's just too incredibly much to bear. They just can't do it anymore. I'd encourage you. There's a God who loves you, who wants to go through it with you. There's people he put around you. There's resources he put in your path. Being part of this community, joining a small group and being known. You were never meant to do it on your own. Whatever trial, whatever difficulty, whatever frustration, whatever stresses are in your life, you were never meant to do it alone. So don't you dare try. Don't you dare think you're honoring God by just hanging on and going, see God, I can handle it. God's going, are you kidding me? You were never meant to do it alone. That was never the way it was meant to be.